Hi, I'm Derek from Moonbeam, and this is 26 Questions with Derek.
Hi, Derek. Thank you for taking the time to join us for this 26 Questions interview today.
Well, thanks. Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
All right, let's get this started. Where did you get the idea of Moonbeam or Moonriver?
Yeah, so we've been at this a while. So we've really started kind of on this back in 2019, and I think there was two ideas that were kind of the driving ideas. One was kind of a pretty big bet that the kind of Ethereum, like EVM technology and the Ethereum developer kind of tech stack was going to be kind of a permanent fixture of dApps and of kind of development in the Web3 space. So that was one big bet we made. And then the second big bet was around interoperability, right? That we were going to move into a multi-chain kind of environment, and that when you're in a multi-chain environment, then communication between different blockchains was going to be kind of a critical capability. And so I think those were the two main ideas. And then because those were both important to us, that kind of led us to Polkadot then, because they have this kind of native interoperability as part of the system there. And that's kind of how we chose to build some of the core features of Moonbeam, which are these kind of Ethereum compatibility features.
What is the story and motivation behind the name Moonriver, and what made you choose Kusama and no others like BSC or Polygon?
Yeah. So, I mean, there is kind of a story to the names, actually both Moonriver and Moonbeam. So, the name Moonbeam came from, it comes from a song. So there's an old song called Polka Dots and Moonbeams. And we kind of thought that was maybe, that kind of made sense given that we're working so closely, with as part of the Polkadot ecosystem. And so then that kind of has, there's kind of been this trend then, or kind of that's something that we continue to do, where we name our networks after songs. So Moonriver is also an old song, and so we that's how we chose kind of that name. The question of why did we choose, so for Moonriver, why did we choose Kusama and not some other network? I kind of already touched on this, that the kind of the key feature for us is this cross-chain interoperability. You can see it in the market now that there's a lot of blockchains, and then there's a huge amount of innovation going on. Different kind of teams pursuing different kinds of bridging, technologies and strategies. But our belief is that having this kind of networking capability built into the base layer protocol, such as is the case with Polkadot, arguably also in Cosmos. So this is quite important, right? This is a way that different blockchains can communicate very securely with each other.
Can you tell us about the background and experience of the Moonbeam team, and how will they carry out your project during the current pandemic?
So I think, perhaps a little bit unusually, a lot of the team, that is working on Moonbeam, many of us have quite a bit of experience building products in the Web2 space. So I think, I say that's maybe a little unusual because a lot of teams, I think, in the Web3 space are new teams, right? I mean, this might be the first, project or kind of effort that they're working on. We've been, the team here has been working on a number of different, Web2 cloud, oriented products for many years. And so I do think that's been helpful to us. Obviously, a lot of ideas are different in Web3 versus Web2, but just that experience of, building complex software, doing it with high quality, on the kind of marketing and go-to-market side, with the kinds of things that make sense to do. I think these have been, things where we've been able to rely on kind of past experience to help guide some of our efforts here. So I think that's been helpful. I think that it's an experienced team, and we've been many of us have been working together for some time, building complex kind of software platforms.
What is the main focus of the Moonbeam project in the blockchain industry? Who is Moonbeam's main target audience?
Yeah. So Moonbeam and Moonriver both. These are developer-oriented platforms. So our customer is a developer. Our customer is a protocol team or someone trying to build something. So that that kind of informs a lot of what we do, not only the product that we've made, the kinds of support and materials that we have, what our marketing looks like, what our go-to-market efforts look like. it's, we kind of don't have any end users in a way. Like, our customer is this development team who's going to be deploying to either Moonriver or Moonbeam. And then they in turn like are building the products that we're going to have like end users. And so, yeah, I think that's kind of informed a lot of like how we've even set ourselves up and how, and what we've built. And we continue to just have this very strong kind of developer focus. I mean, and I think actually that matches with Polkadot. I mean, if you look at Polkadot itself, I mean, that also is like a very developer-oriented, platform. So I think that there's a lot of, kind of synergy there between the two.
Many projects only focus on the price of their tokens in the market, but not on the utility of the tokens. What's the utility of the MOVR and GLMR tokens?
One of the main ideas that we have in both of those networks is to provide as close as we can make it to Ethereum in terms of functionality, right? So kind of this highly Ethereum compatible environment. So in that context, the underlying platform token, it has the same utility that ETH does on Ethereum. So it's used as kind of the gas token to meter smart contract like execution or other kinds of interactions with the chain. So it kind of provides this security function. So I'd say that's the most important, or that's a very important source of utility. There actually are some other sources as well. We do extend and have other features other than this base kind of Ethereum feature set. So I'll give you some examples. We have a full on-chain governance system. So this is a system that allows token holders to vote on and do things like vote on upgrades, vote on changes to like how the system behaves. So these are all things that is a utility kind of the underlying platform token to kind of participate in the on-chain governance system. There also is a staking system. So there's a staking system to let users select what collators are going to be active on the system. Collators in our system are basically block producers, or people kind of producing blocks. Those are other sources of utility, and there will also be a utility around some of the cross-chain scenarios that will be coming to market shortly. Really kind of you need the token to interact with the system, like in almost any of the meaningful ways. That's kind of the utility of the token.
How do you plan to differentiate Moonriver from Moonbeam network to attract applications on it rather than just being a place to test applications before joining Moonbeam?
Yes, this is a kind of question that comes up a lot these days. So it's a little bit of a nuanced answer where, obviously we have these two deployments, just like there is Kusama and there is Polkadot, right? So there's like these two networks. And I would put it this way, that, there was an original idea that led to the creation of Kusama in the first place, right? So the parity team that's building Polkadot said, hey, we need this kind of environment that is, they called it a canary net, right? So it's an environment where, developers can deploy software, but there'll be real value like on the network, right? So the tokens will have value, like developers can understand kind of how the system works under real conditions. I think what they realized is that when you just have test nets, there's some things you just can't test. Like, so for example, the example I heard one of the parity folks give is that, governance, right? So if you have a set of on-chain governance features, and it's on a test net with a valueless token, like no one engages. Like there's no reason for anyone to engage. You just can't try, there's no way to like see if any of the features are kind of working. So you need to have value there in order for stakeholders to feel, engaged, and then be able, and then have them kind of motivated to participate in governance. So that was kind of the original idea is, hey, let's create this environment. It's somehow before the main environment, but it still allows people to deploy there and understand like how their, the system works, how, their protocols are going to work under real conditions. Now, I think as with many things, there's an original idea, that a creator has, and they kind of create this thing, but then it sometimes gets used in ways that like weren't like the original intention like of the creator. And so I think that's kind of happened here where, the original idea still exists. So I think this idea of, hey, let's be a canary net and we're a place where people deploy first. And we, in fact, are going to be deploying features first to Moonriver whenever we have new features before deploying them to Moonbeam. So there is this aspect of, features go there first, maybe deployments go there first. But I think what's happened then is, over time is, these networks are almost living things, right? So you have some set of token holders, there's this on-chain governance system, they can kind of express like their will, like, through voting and through, being token holders. And so I think this is where you start to see that there's, that both Kusama as well as Moonriver, they have kind of a will of their own, right? Where I think that, you know, they in some ways don't want to be always seen as, hey, I'm just the canary net for either Polkadot or Moonbeam. And so we see actually some teams where they might say, you know what, our final deployment destination is like Moonriver. Like we're not going to deploy to Moonbeam. And conversely, we also see the opposite, where people might say, hey, I'm just going to deploy to Moonbeam and not Moonriver. So you know, I think it is the case that it's both a canary net, but also like it's a network in its own right, where it may make sense for, you know, people to deploy. And you know, when I'm asked, okay, well, what's kind of the difference there? I just think that there's so much demand right now for like credible, decentralized, and secure block space that, you know, we're seeing that like it's going to get filled on both without a doubt, right? And possibly with different use cases.
I have been following your project for some time, and I really appreciate your work so far. I would like to ask, what percentage of rewards are you thinking of giving to the community, which will help you win a parachain?
So for this answer, I'll just preface it with like I'll be answering on behalf of the Moonbeam Foundation. So that we do have, you know, some different like organizations that are part of the, you know, kind of the Moonbeam kind of family. So there is the Moonbeam Foundation is really the organization that I'm not part of, that is you know, kind of running the Crowdloan for the Moonbeam parachain, you know, kind of slot auction. So I'll answer kind of on their behalf. And so we did recently put out you know, some additional information about the Moonbeam Foundation put out additional information about what this Crowdloan is going to look like. And just maybe to step back for a minute, like, so just to explain in case people, you know, aren't aware of what these things are. So we're about to enter into a phase where an initial 5 parachain slots are going to be made available on Polkadot. So this is really the launch of parachains on Polkadot, you know, of which Moonbeam is seeking to be, one of those 5. As part of the effort to have Moonbeam occupy one of those first 5 slots, we are running a what's called a crowd loan. A crowd loan is a way that users can basically contribute DOT tokens to help Moonbeam as a project become one of the first 5 parachains on Polkadot. So we kind of need this, you know, the community to kind of support, you know, Moonbeam's efforts to, you know, become one of the first 5 parachains. And so there's an auction mechanism in place that kind of is used to select like which, you know, project teams are going to occupy these first 5 slots. And then, you know, this crowd loan like is kind of a campaign that the Moonbeam Foundation is running to help with that, right? To help kind of get the support needed from the Moonbeam community to occupy one of these slots. And so what are the details of this crowd loan? So this was recently released you know, earlier this week. And so basically there's as a reward for supporting the Moonbeam crowd loan and, you know, helping Moonbeam occupy one of the slots on one of the initial 5 slots on Polkadot, there's a 10% reward. So it's 10% of the Genesis supply of GLMR tokens, which is the name of the token on Moonbeam, will be given out as rewards to people that help you know, support the project in the crowd loan. And this is going to follow like very closely, the mechanics are going to follow very closely to what happened on Moonriver. I mean, in fact, we're using some of the same code, like the rewards palette we have that has the distribution logic will be the same, you know, very similar. And so for contributors, there'll be, you know, 30% of the rewards amount will be kind of provided like right when the network, you know, fully launches, when, you know, transfers are enabled and the EVM is enabled. And then the remaining 70% of the rewards due to them will kind of get vested out linearly over the course of the 96 weeks, you know, kind of the occupancy of the slot. That like you know, when you win a slot like on Polkadot, the maximum length of time that you can occupy that slot is 96 weeks. So that's what we're kind of going for. Yeah, just one other important detail is that you know, in the crowd loan, you know, the amount of the total rewards that, you know, any given contributor or supporter would receive is basically the proportional amount of their contribution relative to the overall contribution. So if you contributed, you know, 1% of the total amount that was contributed toward the crowd loan, then you'll receive 1% of the rewards.
Is the Moonriver liquidity mining program still going to happen? If yes, what are the main challenges for it to start?
Yeah, so there is, the Moonbeam Foundation again, has announced, a fairly significant liquidity bootstrapping program. And so just to step back and provide context, one of the things that we've seen is that, I would say kind of the use cases that are the most prevalent right now, even, just 2 months in on Moonriver, what we're seeing in terms of activity is in the DeFi sector. So I would say that there's quite a number of DeFi projects that, even in the first 2 months of Moonriver being operational, have deployed to Moonriver. We expect the same on Moonbeam. We've been working actually with a number of teams that are not deployed yet, but that, are working on either developing their protocols or working towards a deployment. So there's quite a bit of activity in primarily the DeFi sector. I'd say secondarily, NFT and gaming would be kind of second, but primarily DeFi. And so in order to kind of bootstrap a DeFi ecosystem, I think you can see this like on a number of other chains, that there often is this kind of like a liquidity bootstrapping mechanism that's employed to help, kind of attract like liquidity into this, what's a nascent, in our case, a nascent like DeFi ecosystem, and just help get kind of the engine going, right? So help, kind of get assets like into the system so that, they can be, they can be swapped, they can be lent, borrowed, and so on, and all these different like DeFi functions. The Moonbeam Foundation is like running an overall liquidity bootstrapping program, and it will initiate shortly here. So the kind of the first initiative, like in that program, is in kind of a collaboration and partnership with the team over at Sushi. So Sushi is a team that we've been engaged with for quite some time. I would say even back from last year, kind of shortly after the the kind of initial drop of it starting, and Chef Nomi and all of these things. I mean, we've been kind of engaged with that team for some time. And so they Sushi is kind of like launching has kind of deployed like all of their contracts, and the liquidity mining programs are set to commence on Monday, so like next week. And the form that it'll take will be basically rewards that are provided to people that are LPing into a certain set of pools on this the Sushi on the Sushi deployment on Moonriver. And we fully expect, we're just as we were talking about before, anything that's kind of happening on Moonriver, we then expect, it's kind of a first run at it, and then a lot of those same programs will also like take place on Moonbeam. But I'd say that this Sushi kind of like initiative is the first of what are likely to be many initiatives, because there is like a significant budget that's been set aside to help bootstrap like the ecosystem. And so that's kind of the first initiative, and there's going to be other initiatives that will be following that are similar in nature, right? That are designed to help bootstrap either TVL, liquidity, other kinds of necessary ingredients for a DeFi ecosystem to kind of grow and flourish.
I would like to ask how prepared you are for security on Moonriver, or how to prepare for a hacker attack, and users will be guaranteed about what rights when the attack occurs.
Yeah, so I mean, this is kind of I would say that this is a job that is never done. I mean, this is something that teams have to kind of be thinking about and improving and investing in continuously. I'd say that we part of like what the benefit we have is basically, and part of the motivation for even choosing Polkadot in the first place is that we do get some benefits even from deploying into the as parachains. So I think one is that we're using the substrate framework. So rather than us trying to build a lot of these features from scratch, we're leveraging kind of a framework that is a very high quality, and that itself has a lot of security analysis, audits and other things on it. This framework that we're using to build Moonbeam itself. So that's called Substrate. So that's one thing that I would say was an initial choice that helps us a lot. And then being a parachain, I think also like has some benefits there, because one of the benefits of being a parachain is you get this kind of shared security element, right? So we kind of are able to launch with like a high degree of like network security, by being a parachain, right? We're kind of renting security from, the Kusama and Polkadot relay chains for our network. But, I would say that, those are all kind of choices we made that are helpful. But, when it comes to security, the way we think about it is it's more of a program, right? So you kind of have an overarching set of goals you're trying to achieve, and then you have many different kind of like initiatives underneath that like help you achieve, these goals of being highly secure, of being able to protect like user funds. So, I'll just rattle off some of these elements. There's probably too many to name, but some of it comes down to just like basic, kind of code quality, right? Like, I think a lot of security issues come down to some kind of flaw, like in the implementation like of the protocol itself. And so, to that end, we've spent quite a bit of time on code quality, automated tests. We have like a extensive set of automated tests. We have an internal review process where any change to the software is reviewed by multiple people. I think that's you kind of say, well, maybe that's just part of building software, but I think this is a big element of security, is kind of just doing a good job at these basic kind of elements of creating like high quality software. So, again, this is our experience coming from the past, I think has helped us in this regard. This is something that, we've made quite a bit of investments in. Those reviews will get augmented by, third-party reviews. We have had 2 security audits at this point. That's an additional way to de-risk things. But, I would comment here that I see a lot of people say, oh, like, has it been audited or not? And it's kind of in people's minds, this binary thing. It's like, oh, well, someone looked at it, so then it must be secure. But I think that's just one element of like many that are needed, right? And like, for these auditors, as smart as they are, they're kind of looking at software at one point in time. And the system is pretty complicated. So, you don't want to rely on only like an external audit to try to catch like any problems. But we have done that. I think any, team that's serious is going to do that as well, to have, kind of external eyes on software. But I'll give you another example of something that maybe people don't think about, is that every week we have like an internal security awareness session for our own employees. So like, well, what does that have to do with this? Basically, like if you're an attacker trying to attack the chain, one thing that they could try to do is basically attack like the people, the developers themselves, like the people kind of working at the organization. So we've invested time into security training, and basically every week there might be a topic saying, okay, like here's like an area, make sure that like your own personal security is like buttoned up in this area. And so it's another example of something that I think most people wouldn't think of, but as part of like an overarching security program that you need to run if you're trying to be as have a good security posture in general. So yeah, those are some examples. I don't want to keep going on, but those are some examples.
How can I use MOVR in the Moonriver ecosystem? Is there any reward mechanisms for holding Moonriver tokens? What are the benefits of holding it in the long term?
Yeah, so and again, answers for Moonriver and Mover are quite similar to what the answers would be for GLMR and Moonbeam, since they really do have the same code base. But I'll answer in the context of Moonriver, since that's a functioning network right now. So there are a number of things you can do. If you're a Mover holder, one thing is that there is an integral staking function. This will exist again on both Moonriver and Moonbeam. And so you can kind of participate like in, the mechanism of block production, right? So by staking your Mover or GLMR tokens, you're kind of selecting like which nodes are going to be in this like special collator role that are the block producers of the system. And, this is pretty important for us to have this kind of open and decentralized system for selecting like the collators, because, I think that's a big part of ensuring kind of like fairness and censorship resistance, of the chain itself. And you do get rewards, so for staking, you do get rewards. Right now, there's a very high rate of staking like on the system. So I think that probably at least probably about half of the tokens in circulation on Moonriver are staked right now. So pretty high uptake rate on that. I would say that the second opportunity, like for use of MOVR tokens is well, there's governance. I mentioned that before, but probably the one I'd highlight that is kind of what the questioner was asking here, I think, is basically to engage with protocols that are deployed in the ecosystem. There's a lot at this point, right? And so I think there's all sorts of different opportunities to engage with. I mean, if they're DeFi protocols, there's probably some way to actually deposit like tokens. But there are games. There are also a number of NFT projects. I can't even follow them all, but there's a number of folks that are launching different NFT collections. Those have gotten a lot of engagement, are quite popular. So there's multiple different ways to engage. I'd say that. Obviously, I think it depends on kind of what your interests are, basically, like into which area it might make sense to engage with tokens. But all those actions, anything you do on the system, requires these MOVR tokens, basically. And in some sense, it's the base, kind of the base asset on the system, much like ETH is on Ethereum.
How does Moonbeam stand out? What is special about Moonbeam?
Yeah, so I would kind of say this kind of tying back to something I said at the beginning. So the idea from the beginning was always this, it's kind of this compatibility combined with interoperability. And so, the one effort that, we've spent a lot of time on is this Ethereum compatibility effort. That kind of makes the system very accessible to a lot of developers, but I would say that that's not necessarily unique, right? I mean, there are a number of EVM compatible chains like out there outside of Ethereum, right? So you've got Polygon, BSC, Avalanche. I mean, there's different like EVM compatible chains. So I think really the thing that's unique about Moonriver and Moonbeam is that there's things that we can do because we're part of Polkadot that these other chains like can't do. There's kind of unique scenarios that are enabled by the Polkadot architecture. And really, some of these features have not even shipped yet. So like we're about to ship some of the first ones like onto Moonriver shortly here. And so what are these features? So in Polkadot you have this this like mechanism or this protocol called XCMP, which is the way that parachains can kind of natively communicate with each other with high security. And so these are some of the first features we'll be shipping, are basically an ability to move tokens so that, for example, you can take like a KSM token on the Kusama relay chain. You can move it to Moonriver. When it's there, it kind of acts like as an ERC20, like it has like an ERC20 compatible kind of like interface to it. So you can use it in a lot of the protocols I was mentioning before. But then you can also move it back. So if you want to move it back to the Kusama relay chain, you can move it back. That's a simple scenario. The same scenario is going to be the case with other parachains. There's the ability to kind of move assets like bidirectionally. But it extends beyond assets. So give you an example, like we're helping support the team at Lido, right? So Lido is they make a liquid staking derivative. They're one of the largest protocols right now on Ethereum, making a kind of a liquid staked version of Ethereum, like on mainnet. And so we're working with them to create a similar product, or they're creating a similar product. We're providing technical support for the Kusama and Polkadot ecosystem. And so the way that's going to work is that Lido is deploying a set of contracts and a dApp on Moonriver, but then and they will be to Moonbeam as soon as it's launched. But then they're kind of remote controlling staking functionality that's on the relay chain, right? So we're kind of creating like the underlying kind of primitives they need to be able to almost kind of remote control staking on a different chain. And so that's something, again, that's kind of pretty unique to Polkadot, this ability to securely allow for kind of cross-chain kind of functions to be called like in this way. And so that's kind of where I see our unique differentiator, is enabling this kind of like these cross-chain interactions powered by Polkadot, but bringing them into kind of our like Ethereum compatible environment so that you can use the Ethereum development tools to basically access this cross-chain functionality and assets. That's kind of how I see us differentiating against other EVM compatible chains, because we're gonna there's gonna be a lot of these integrations to like all sorts of other like interesting assets and functions that are like on Polkadot. And so we expect quite a lot of these like integrations to be available.
Can you explain how Moonriver goes beyond basic EVM compatibility in a more easy to understand way?
Yeah, so I would highlight a few things there. I mean, one is the thing we just talked about, this kind of cross-chain integrations. And yeah, just maybe to provide a little bit more detail on how they work. They take the form of precompiles. Like, so for those of you not familiar, a precompile is kind of like a built-in smart contract that's like in the EVM kind of, without having to deploy it. It's kind of built in. And so, to take an example of, these like token, movement scenarios, like from the EVM, it looks like a smart contract, but when you're invoking functions on it, it may then under the hood invoke these like substrate functions, XCMP, these other kind of underlying actions that will go and perform cross-chain operations. But it still is compatible. It kind of looks like just a smart contract from, from an Ethereum developers or from the EVM like perspective. So we're doing, that's the pattern that we're using for like a lot of the integrations. We're kind of, base EVM plus extending it with all of these like precompiles to like access kind of promote features, let's call it, assets and features. There are some other things though. I mean, I would say that just having kind of built Ethereum like using Substrate, so kind of having done this Ethereum implementation in Substrate, there are some other like benefits that are notable. I mean, one is I would say this kind of on-chain governance system is obviously something that doesn't exist on many other chains. And it's quite like it's quite robust. I mean, there's a full on-chain governance system with that allows users to vote, and in particular, it allows them to vote on upgrades. So I think this is kind of a quite important feature like of Substrate. What that means is that it's referred to sometimes as forkless upgrades. So what's meant by that is that instead of having to like socially coordinate people and say, hey, like here's a new upgrade, everyone upgrade their nodes, you can actually like on-chain upgrade. So you kind of say, hey, this is the next version that like we're proposing to release, and then people vote on it, right? They say, yes, that I agree, no, I don't agree. If it passes like that upgrade, then the upgrade actually happens. Like, so it's kind of an on-chain system where like that upgrade will actually take effect. And so that's a way that that's kind of a pretty cool feature that prevents forks from happening, right? So you're kind of getting the token holders to always kind of be weighing in on what the future direction of the chain is. And I think that upgradability is something that it allows like for like a lot more updates to happen. I mean, we've had like a ton of updates already, like on Moonriver. We've probably had 10 updates or something in the last 2 months. Or the last several months. And so I think this kind of ability to like update more frequently is like a big competitive advantage, because you can kind of adapt more quickly to changing market conditions, to like the feedback you're getting from, in our case, like the developers that are, kind of the users that we're working with.
I understand that parachains have several advantages. Why would a project build on Moonbeam or Moonriver rather than creating my own parachain or parathread on Polkadot?
Yeah, that's a good question. So you have that choice. So I think a developer coming into the the Polkadot ecosystem, that's probably one of the most important choices to make up front, is to say, hey, am I going to use Substrate to build a parachain? Is that the right fit for my project? Or do I work with an existing parachain like Moonbeam and deploy, use a more smart contract-like approach, for the deployment? What I would say is this, that there's trade-offs, kind of the pros and cons to like both approaches. I would say that to build something with Substrate is like, it's very, very powerful, right? So you're kind of have this framework where you can build your own chains. You can tailor that chain to exactly what you need, right? I mean, you can make it optimized for your use case. On the flip side, like it is more complicated. Like I'd certainly say that, because you are still building your own chain, so you're kind of it's more infrastructural, I'd say, right? Because you're going to be dealing with things like, okay, well, who's going to be the block producers? How do I incentivize them? Like, there's these kind of questions that you're going to deal with that are kind of more at this chain level. And so I think as a result, it kind of becomes clear, if you have more of a, an application you're trying to build and like attract end users, I think the smart contract approach probably makes more sense, because then you're outsourcing that like lower level stuff to someone like us, basically, right? So like we're kind of building this infrastructure, you kind of leverage that, and then as a developer, you're just focused on the app logic itself, and then kind of like the user interface and kind of interacting with the users. But I would say it's kind of a little bit dependent on your needs. What we found is that for a lot of developers, like this kind of smart contract like approach is preferred, because that's what they know, right? So like if they're coming from Ethereum, they already are familiar with these tools. They may already have like code that they just want to deploy, that makes like working with Moonbeam kind of the easy proposition. If you have a team that really needs this like full control, then the parachain may make more sense. It is a lot more expensive too to deploy a parachain, right? So as we're just discussing, we need to go through this process of a Crowdloan and other things that we were talking about, earlier versus just deploying in gas fees like you have on smart contract parachains like Moonbeam.
What are some of the major achievements that Moonriver has achieved, and what milestones are planned in the upcoming months or years?
Well, I would say that, as I mentioned, I think Moonriver's been live for just 2 months now. Like, that's pretty much how long it's been launched. And there's been like a lot of activity on it. So, some of that activity were folks that we had worked with, a lot of it not, right? A lot of it from other teams. So, I mean, at this point in the first 2 months, we're seeing, a lot of transactional activity, many dozens and dozens of like deployments of like different protocols across DeFi, NFT and gaming use cases. Those three in particular, I would say, I would highlight. And I mean, I think that like it's a pretty, from our perspective, it's been a very strong start, and like we've been blown away actually by like the amount of engagement and interest there. So I think that we'll continue to see more protocols deploy, more transactions, more activity. We've been working quite hard at helping make sure that all of the infrastructural elements that teams need is present, like on Moonriver, and we'll be doing the same on Moonbeam. So some of those elements are things like, for example, like last week, we had a deployment of like a fork of the Gnosis multi-sig like contracts. Like that was an important element that a lot of the teams needed. They needed a multi-sig contract to store any like larger amounts of funds. The graph, like a lot of teams needed like the graph support to be able to provide responsive UIs and particularly like reporting data to their users. This week we launched like Etherscan, like integration in partnership with them. This was, I would say, probably the top requested features from developers. They wanted basically like Etherscan as a block explorer to be able to verify their contracts and other things. So yeah, I think these are the kinds of things we're working on, are these infrastructural elements, and then we expect like more deployment activity to be happening.
Can you name some of your recent partnerships that can help with your project? Is there any partnership that will take place in the near future? If yes, are you able to tell us with whom?
So, I mean, I just mentioned a few of the important ones from the last couple of weeks, so maybe I kind of stole a bit of the answer to this question there. But yeah, I mean, these, there's, we're not, there's more coming. We have a significant, like, kind of pipeline of, project deployments of folks that we've been helping support from a technical perspective to deploy. I would say that probably one of the major next infrastructural elements that's that will unlock like a number of scenarios is like Oracle support. So there will be some announcements soon about like additional Oracle support like on Moonriver. I would say that the unlock there is that there's a whole class of DeFi protocols, particularly in the lending and borrowing space, that require Oracle support to be able to function. So those teams are kind of blocked right now, but will be like unblocked shortly. So I'd say that's one thing that is top of mind. And obviously we look forward also to kind of repeating a lot of these same infrastructural deployments on Moonbeam, like once it's launched as well, right? So I think it should be significantly faster to do the same deployments, like for our partners to kind of do the same deployments on Moonbeam once it's launched.
How to become a Moonbeam ambassador? Do I need to meet any requirements to be accepted? And what will be my role as an ambassador for the platform?
Yeah, we have quite an active ambassador community. So that's a great way to just, if you want to engage and learn more about the project, I mean, that's a great way to do it. We launched the program back in January, and there's been like a huge amount of interest in it. So the ambassador community is quite large, quite active at this point. There is an application process, so that can be found like on the moonbeam.network website. But I think the feedback I've gotten is it's like a very kind of like open and welcoming community. So I do think that is like a great way to engage with us. I think a lot of the team members are directly engaged, like in our Discord, like with and Telegram with like these ambassadors. With the ambassadors are part of the community, and yeah, so I just think it's a great way to engage. And I would encourage anyone who's interested to apply via the Moonbeam.network website.
I think your project is really great. What is the best way of obtaining Glimmer tokens?
Well, Glimmer tokens right now, probably the next opportunity to do so before the network is fully launched would be via this Crowdloan that we talked about earlier in the interview. That is going to be commencing shortly, and it also has this great effect of helping the Moonbeam project come to life, basically, right, to become like a parachain on Polkadot. So. That's probably the next best opportunity. That's also like very helpful to the project. Would be to participate in the Crowdloan, and there's a number of ways that one can do that. And yeah, I think that's probably the best the best way. There'll obviously be other ways. Like once the network is launched, there'll be other ways to acquire tokens, but that's the best way in the short term.
The focus of the Moonbeam and Moonriver networks is to build a multi-chain future, but really this multi-chain future can only be established if Moonriver gets involved in it.
Yeah, well, so I'll divide it into two kind of answers. I mean, we talk about a multi-chain future. It's just worth explaining what we mean by that, right? So I mean, our point of view is that almost everything that has been done in the Web3 space and protocol development to date has been engineered with like a single chain deployment in mind, right? So that's almost everything that you see and I can think of. A lot of times it was Ethereum, right? So people said, okay, here's Ethereum, I'm going to build a protocol, it's going to be deployed to Ethereum. And at this point, I think it's quite clear to us that this kind of like single chain environment is just not the environment that's going to be the case moving forward. There's permanently multiple chains that are going to be in the environment, and possibly specialized chains like on Polkadot. It encourages these kind of specialized chains. And so our take is almost everything that's happened to date has to get reimagined for what it's going to look like in this kind of like multi-chain environment. What does it look like for these protocols to be natively multi-chain, right? I mean, you take a DeFi protocol right now, you have it deployed on one chain, there's some set of liquidity there, then teams are saying, oh, well, let me just take that and deploy it also over here, and there's some set of liquidity there. But you can start to see people are saying, well, does that make sense to have two different deployments with two different like sets of liquidity underneath? How do we like connect them? How do we make the liquidity on one chain like available to users on another chain? These problems have not been solved yet. So I think, almost everything you see has to get like reimagined for what it looks like, in a multi-chain environment. So that's exciting. I think that's like a huge opportunity. And I expect there to be almost new winners that kind of are able to figure this out, are going to become like the dominant protocols, like, and there may be different ones from the ones that dominated, let's say, Ethereum, right, in the first kind of wave. So that's kind of context. And then the question of like, what role does Moonriver and Moonbeam play like as that unfolds? We're just super strong believers in that, like the Kusama and Polkadot ecosystems have like a special role to play in that change. And the reason is that it's built into this interoperability is built into the protocol itself. So there's certain kinds of like architectures for a protocol that are uniquely enabled by Kusama, Polkadot, and Substrate. And so I think as people are kind of figuring out, like, kind of reimagining what things look like in a multi-chain environment, like, Kusama and Polkadot are going to pick up like a lot of these innovations, because they just have like a broader canvas that you can paint on, right? You have like these very powerful tools and networking that at your disposal. And so we see our role in that context to kind of be, let's call it like, almost like the easy access point, right? So like we're doing work to like build all these integrations into this familiar environment so we can make it accessible, right? So developers can come in like with their already existing knowledge and tools, but have these like extended kind of set of capabilities available to them that are cross-chain. And so that's kind of how we see ourselves, helping to drive this forward.
Has Moonriver seen much development in the NFT space, and why should projects consider the Moonbeam and Moonriver network for their NFTs?
We have, I would say that a lot of the projects that have deployed NFTs are kind of organic, and ones that, we don't necessarily like know the teams or anything. I would say that this is, the whole NFT space like is like in its like, early stages right now, right? I mean, my suspicion is that, the kind of more artwork based NFTs, that's kind of the, kind of scratching the surface. There's going to be quite a bit more development like in this area. And we're seeing already a crossover like into like DeFi and gaming and other, other what were formerly discrete areas. It's all getting kind of like mixed together now. I would say that, the main benefit of, Moonriver and Moonbeam at this point is that you have this Ethereum compatible environment, so you can use all the same tools, code, like other things that, that you're familiar with to deploy your NFT project. But it is also like a new ecosystem. So I think that, unlike, some other ecosystems, like, it's, you have an opportunity to kind of stand out and be an early mover, like in like a new ecosystem, which is going to be big, but, as it grows, like I said, there's only, we've been in operation 2 months, like, so it's still quite early. And so I think that's kind of the opportunity, not just for NFT projects, but for any project really, right? Is, do you want to be, do you want to kind of be an early mover, like, into this new ecosystem that is going to, grow significantly over time? And for working with Moonbeam or Moonriver, is it a value to you to be able to use all these existing tools, technologies, and code that you already have in order to participate?
Okay, last question. Community is important for the progress of a project. How many users are currently using the Moonriver platform? And what's the future plan to increase Moonriver users?
Yes, I don't know that I have like a user count statistics that that I can give you offhand. I mean, I know that, in this last couple months, there's probably been between 3 and 4 million like transactions or so. I think when I looked last, there was something like over 100K, wallet addresses. So yeah, those probably aren't quite accurate to like users, but like, you get some sense of kind of what's been happening. I think that like to grow, and we're seeing growth like, steadily in terms of adoption, project deployments, other things. I do think most of the growth will come from further product deployments, like, that have interesting, use cases. I do think that the liquidity bootstrapping programs we spoke about earlier have an important role to play in bootstrapping the DeFi ecosystem. DeFi is still, I would say DeFi and NFT are the two kind of use cases that draw the most users at this point, that have like real users. And so the fact that we're seeing, a significant organic activity in both those areas, is quite encouraging for us. And then, we're trying to help support, those developments as best we can, both with, Moonbeam Foundation has a grants program that that is being used to support projects, the liquidity bootstrapping program. These are all some of the initiatives that are in play to help promote activity and user adoption.
All right, thank you for answering 20 questions from the community. Now it's your turn to ask our fans 6 questions. Do you have the 6 questions ready?
I do, so let me pull them up here. So, all right, so yeah, let's go through these questions. So the first question, for viewers to answer is, how many integrations does Moonbeam have in its ecosystem? Question number 2, what are the features that make Moonbeam Ethereum compatibility go beyond the EVM? Question 3, what makes Moonbeam different than Moonriver? Question 4, what is the next big milestone for the Moonbeam community? Question 5, why are Ethereum-based projects and developers using Moonbeam's technology? And last, question 6, what is Moonbeam's main channel for developers?
Awesome session. Thank you, Derek, for the questions. We hope you guys like the interview session with Derek. For fans whose questions are selected, please claim your rewards as per instructions in the description box below. And for those who want to participate and win USDT, simply answer the 6 questions that Derek had asked. Comment your answers in the comment section below, and we will pick 6 lucky winners. Thank you once again for coming on to our show, Derek. Till the next time, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Bye!
Bye, thanks for having me.